Support Lightning Debate on Patreon.
Hi guys, Jeff here, and I'm coming at you with part 5 of the LD for Dummies series covering theory and theory shell. So this video on trying to explain theory has been requested by a couple of people, and I totally get it because theory is kind of complex. Since if you come from a more traditional circuit, it's not really used. So if you just get into advanced theory when you go to a national circuit tournament, you're going to be a little lost. But trust me, once you break it down to its most basic components, theory really is very, very simple. All right, so let's just get right into it. Before we do that, we're going to have to recap what we covered in the previous parts of the series. In part 1, we covered how to write your framework. In part 2, we covered how to write your case. In part 3, we covered how to win on the framework. And in part 4, we covered critiques and how to respond to them. So if you haven't seen any of these videos, check them out. Links are in the description. And now we're going to get right into theory. So to understand theory, we need to understand LD's rules. So you need to know that the actual official rules, there are only really 2. And those are speech and prep time limits and the evidence standard. The official NSDA rules, if you go online, just put that, and all the other leagues pretty much follow suit with pretty much these are the only rules for LD. So to understand that, if you've been doing for an LD for a long time, you know that these aren't really the only rules because there are a lot of unspoken conventions that are expected of you to follow in an LD round. For example, you are expected not to make new arguments in your last speech. That's the most common one. It's considered extremely taboo. But if you look at the official rules, that's not actually against the rules to make an argument in the last speech. It's just considered something you don't do in a debate round, and judges don't want to vote you up on that. So since we have so many rules that are not actual rules that are regulated by the league, and they're just rules, expectations by debaters, what happens when a debater breaks one of these quote-unquote unspoken rules? That's what theory comes in. Theory is basically an argument that says your opponent has broken one of these unspoken rules or one of these unspoken conventions that has been expected in the debate space to be followed. All right, so it's in its basic form, it's like calling a foul in a sport or throwing a challenge flag. However, it's not enough to say that in the debate that your opponent broke the rule. You need to explain these things. You have to explain what rule they broke, why breaking that rule is important, and what the punishment is for breaking the rule. And this is where the theory shell comes into play. So let's talk about the anatomy of a theory shell and how it's constructed. So a fully developed theory argument, it's called a shell, and it's broken down into parts of interpretation, violation, standard, voter, and then after that are paradigm issues, which are technically not part of the shell. However, you really should answer these things at the end after the shell. These things should be addressed, and we'll cover those a little later. So first, let's get into the interpretation. What is that? So it's simply stating the rule that you expect should be followed in the debate space. So an example, if someone is running something like disclosure theory, where they expect before the round that you disclose your case in exchange for them disclosing their case as well. Like they expect that you should disclose your case before the round starts. I had another person comment here that they had asked me whether or not they should disclose in national rounds because a lot of people at the higher levels ask for them to flash their cases. And I told them, yeah, you should. And the reason why is because if they don't, they will run this theory shell on disclosure theory most likely. And they'll run interpretation like this. Debaters must disclose their case before the round starts if they plan to spread, or in general, this is the one I feel is the most likely to appeal or explain theory to people on a more traditional level. But this could be just have debaters disclose their case before the round starts in general. So that's just an example of an interpretation. So now the violation. Here you have to explain what your opponent did specifically to break that rule you stated in the interpretation. So an example of a violation would be, okay, if their interpretation is debaters must disclose their case before the debate if they plan to spread, the violation would be, okay, my opponent violates when I ask before the round if they were going to disclose their case. My opponent refuses, even after I tell them it's necessary for it to be able to understand their case effectively if they plan to spread, and I will gladly give them access to my case in exchange. So that's what you're saying. This is what they did to break that rule. All right, now we get into the standard. The standard explains why your interpretation is good for debate and why it matters that your opponent is not following your rule. So, like the theory shell, there are 3 parts of a standard, and you can have as many standards as you want or feel as necessary in your shell, but we're just going to work with one now to understand what a standard is. So the first part of the standard is the tag. It's just like a contention tag. It's a quick heading to organize your standards so the judge understands your key points when you're going through the theory shell. All right, the second part is the warrant. How bad things happen because the interpretation is not being followed. And the third part happens to be the internal link. Why it would be bad to not follow the interpretation, and it usually follows this format of the standard is key to the voter, which we'll cover later, because of X reason. So let's give into an example shell. So if the interpretation is debaters must disclose their case before the debate if they plan to spread, and the violation is the one we covered in further, well, let's go to a standard. So standard, first one, let's have the tag, balance. Okay, so that's meaning that you're telling the judge that the key thing that we're going to talk about with the standard is making sure that things are balanced on both sides. So the warrant, not disclosing their case will make it difficult for me to dissect their case properly, causing me to use prep time and cross-sects just to understand my opponent's argument, preventing me from taking time to develop adequate responses which my opponent will be able to have time to develop. Okay, then that's your warrant on why not having balance will affect the debate space. And then the internal link, balance is key to fairness, which is the voter, because if the playing field is unbalanced, fair competition cannot exist. It's that same, the standard, which is balance, is key to the voter, which is fairness, which we'll cover later. And that, because of that, you see that the playing field is unbalanced and therefore fair competition cannot exist. Okay, so now we have the voter. So what is the voter? It's telling the judge specifically to detail why the judge should even care about your theory shell in the first place, and why it's important that they do something about it. So an example for that would be fairness is the voter because debate is a competitive activity based on skill. Due to the fact that the ballot requires the judge to vote for the better debater means that it is required that debaters are fairly evaluated. So this is your voter explaining to the judge that these are the impacts of why the debate is negatively affected when my opponent breaks this rule, and how if you keep this rule, the debate will be positively affected. So now we have the full shell here, the interpretation, like we covered it before, the violation, the standard with the tag, the warrant, and the internal link, and finally the voter at the end. So this right here is a fully developed theory shell, and that's the anatomy of what it is, and that's it. However, afterwards, you have an important thing to have to cover, and that is paradigm issues. All right, so what are paradigm issues? So once you have a full shell, you've only got the judge to understand that something needs to happen now, that they should do something now. But what paradigm issues is cover is what that thing they should do is. So there are 3 paradigm issues that need to be answered: drop the debater versus drop the argument, the reverse voting issue, and competing interpretations versus reasonability. So we're going to cover them right here. So drop the debater versus drop the argument. This is the simplest paradigm issue to answer. What it means is that you should cover what the punishment for your opponent breaking that rule that you proposed in theory should be if you win theory. So dropping the argument means that the argument you read theory against will be stricken for the record. This is usually used for marginal abuse, minor infractions, and it has a higher likelihood of success because most judges are not going to be too mad if you ask them to drop an argument because you find it abusive or it prevents you from actively being able to participate in the debate space. All right, so drop the debater means that if you win the theory, you automatically win the round regardless of any of the substantive line by line or framework debate. So this is used for major infractions of abuse. Like, they abused so hard that even if you ask them to drop their argument, it really wouldn't make it fair. So that means they did something super, super serious. It's usually used in cases of arguing against time skew, where they skewed the time so much that it's impossible for you to have even enough time to debate properly. Or in the essence of deterrence, saying what they did was so bad that you should drop them and make them lose in order to make sure that they don't ever try to do something like this again. All right, so the reverse voting issue occurs when the person answering theory wins the theory argument. So if the neg reads theory and the AF reads theory in response, what would happen is the reverse voting issue would be presented by the AF. So the things to note with reverse voting issues. First is that it only applies in the sense when theory requires to drop the debater. So if the neg asks to drop an argument, don't go for a reverse voting issue. It's just going to look really bad. And they will, again, run theory based off reciprocity that, okay, now they have a path to the ballot in a way where I don't have a path to the ballot, where if they win theory, they win, but they also win the substantive. Did they win? However, if I have to win both in order to win, and that's not fair. So that just makes it worse for you to try to run a reverse voting issue on when someone reads theory on drop the argument. That makes no sense. All right, and the next one is winning RVI does not mean you win the debate. When you win a reverse voting issue, it only means you win if you win theory. So you can't win the voting issue and then expect to win. You only win if you win the theory debate, and then you can have a path to the ballot on the reverse voting issue. But that's the only times it applies. And also, it's almost always abbreviated as RVI. So if you hear RVI, understand it means reverse voting issue. Okay, and the last one is competing interpretations versus reasonability. So this asks the question on how the judge should weigh the theory debate and understand who wins theory. So this handles weighing to a degree on theory. So the first thing is competing interpretations means that we're going to use comparative worlds analysis on both interpretations. We're going to essentially split the universe into two, and there's going to be one world where the AF version of theory is what is true. And in another world, there's going to be the neg version of theory, and that's going to be true. And you're going to ask the judge to pick which world they would rather see debate exist in. It is very good when you have significantly more impacts than your opponent, or you feel like your impacts are very well-rounded or very strong, that you're going to be able to convince the judge that your version of the world is going to be more suitable for debate. So that's when you use the competing interpretations model. And then reasonability means that the judge will weigh whether or not reading theory was productive or something that added to the debate, and makes the choice of voting on theory that way. So this one puts the judge even more in the driver's seat, because you are going to have to basically saying to the judge that you say that you have them decide whether or not you reach a bright line, meaning that you reach a threshold on whether or not that you should win theory. So you usually use this in cases of abuse or things like time skew, where you say if you prove that reading theory was productive or educational or does enough of something, it doesn't matter what my opponent response is, that you should still pick me up on theory and I still win the theory debate. Okay, so now we're getting to the part that most people are going to go into, and most people have requested this video for, and how to respond to a shell. But there are several ways to do it. So the first one is saying you don't link in. So that in that case, you just calmly explain that you did not admit the violation they claim you committed, and you explain why, and then you move on to the line by line, getting into the framework and the contentions. That's where you say, okay, I don't link in. None of this theory shell applies to me. After that, there's another one, which is the most common way to respond to a theory shell, which is called the encounter interpretation or the counterinter, where you read a theory shell saying the opposite of your opponent. It usually has an opposite structure saying debaters are not required to disclose their case before the debate if they plan to spread. So you'd write a theory shell. So go back to the video and go back to the parts and explaining why your rule is good for debate. And you would read that theory shell as a counter to their theory shell. And the third one is if their theory shell claims abuse on something that is very minimal or fairly frivolous. It would be more productive to contest the paradigm issues than to read a full-on counter interpretation for saving time and being able to get back into the line by line if you feel that the abuse is minimal and frivolous. Because remember, there are plenty of judges that don't like theory. There are plenty of people who don't want to vote on theory. So you want to be able to understand your judge and understand whether or not they will actually vote on theory. All right, another thing also to suggest is if they read drop the argument theory shell and you do not need that argument, drop the argument. It's not worth it to bother defending it. It's better to extend offense on other parts in your case that you could use to win rather than trying to salvage this argument for the entire debate and not extending the offense you need to make sure that you can secure the ballot. All right, so that's it for the video, guys. Like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Jeff out.